Hi, my name is Jon and I'm part of our global pre-sales operations team here at Anaplan. Some of my major responsibilities are to run technical support on some of our larger, more complex proof of concepts for our large customers, as well as do our connected planning workshops for, again, some prospects as well as customers to kind of show them the art of the possible that we can do within Anaplan. And then my final charter is kind of evangelizing new product functionality here.
And I'm Pierre Kirkinney. I help manage our Center of Excellence, otherwise as we like to refer to ourselves internally, we are the Anaplan on Anaplan team. Now the primary responsibility of my team is to stand up the best-in-class connected planning ecosystem.
We're here to answer your questions on all model building solutions.
So Anaplanners, ask us anything.
So friend of the program and community member Henderson MJ asked for advice on how to more easily transfer models from model builder to model builder.
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I'm interested to hear your response here. What we do internally is we start with the beginning of the model. And what we do is we follow the Anaplan Way methodology whenever we're developing a model, specifically using the agile model that's on the App Hub. And what that allows us to do is capture all the user stories and the requirements within the agile model. And anytime you're transferring a model then to a model builder later in the future, they can always reference back all the requirements or the user stories to easily identify why that model was actually built. The other thing we do is we leverage some of the components that our operational excellence group has come up with. So things like Disco and plans. For those that aren't familiar with Disco, it represents the basic components of any planning model, being your data, your inputs, your systems, your calculations, and your outputs. And the reason that it's helpful for us to use the Disco methodology is oftentimes we'll find ourselves organizing our model according to that acronym. And so when we're building out our modules, we'll create functional areas based on those different buckets, and then we'll bucket our modules depending on where they fall into. So if it's a module that's taking in information, we would classify it as data. If it's a module that holds assumptions or drivers, obviously it would be an input. And then if it's a module that's doing a calculation, we group it under calculation. And that allows our end users then to quickly make sense of how the model's been built out and organized.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, you nailed it right there for most of the governance piece. The last part that I would throw in there is just some naming conventions, right? So what we like to do is keep naming conventions consistent not only in a model, but through your entire model ecosystem, right? So for lists, subsets, line item subsets, save views, have a consistent naming convention that you can follow, and all their model builders also know how to follow going forward.
Yeah.
And that's pretty good for like external governance. But then what Anaplan has done really well lately is the internal documentation within the model itself. So within the last few releases, we have module notes. So being able to put notes on a module to see exactly what this module is for. Within a module itself, you have line item notes, which is great. Yep. For a dashboard and end user, we have tooltips, which is a great way to see exactly what this module is for on a dashboard, as well as my personal favorite, the drill down functionality. So if you just took over a model and you don't really know where this number is coming from, being able to drill down on that calculation to kind of get into the meat and bones of that and see exactly where that's coming from and see which module is kind of running the entire model itself is really beneficial for me.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned some of the platform updates, because the one to me that's been incredibly helpful historically, where I found myself getting frustrated as a model builder taking on a new model, was trying to make sense of the imports. And now that you have the ability to see clearly what the source and target are, as well as being able to see whether or not that source is a list or a saved view or a module, has been incredibly beneficial. And then being able to also track back where exactly that information was coming from and where it's going makes it really easy for a new model builder to pick up on all the different actions.
Nice. Yeah, I'm curious to say then, do you guys do a lot of external still documentation when doing a model itself, or is it mostly internal?
So historically we used to document a lot of what was going on within the model externally. We've shifted away from that to where we've gotten to a point where everything now is documented inside the model itself. So we create documentation dashboards that will be used by admins or end users or model builders. As well, like you mentioned, we leverage some of the new features, whether it's the notes, to make documentation notes where necessary.
Nice. Yeah, and then the last cool thing is being able to use pictures, right, on a dashboard. So being able to leverage maybe PowerPoints being hosted on your box.com folder or something like that, and then putting those PowerPoint slides directly into a dashboard. So anything now that external documentation that we used to do, I mean, I would say 99% of it is now within the model.
Yeah. So Henderson MJ, I hope that helped. Hopefully your models will be more organized and easier to transfer moving forward. Community member Anaplan 78 had a very specific question around cost allocations, which can get actually really complex without understanding the full use case, but brings up a number of concerns with model sparsity. And I think that's a really interesting conversation to have. Jon, I'm interested to know, what are some of the things you've done in order to help reduce model sparsity?
Yeah, Pierre. The one major low-hanging fruit that I kind of go into with sparsity is using list subsets when needed, right? So say you have a list that is very large in scale, but it maybe some of it only applies to a specific region within a model, some of it only applies to another. So create subsets for those specific regions within the list so that when you add that to the module itself, your module doesn't have a lot of sparsity or unneeded list items where it doesn't need to. Now there's a caveat to that though, because with trying to save with that sparsity, you also have to think about the scalability and the functionality going forward with that specific list and calculation, right? Because later on in the model's life cycle, maybe other list items actually do apply to that region that it didn't apply to before. So you need to have those systems and functions in place that you can automatically or systematically, add those list subsets into that subset when going forward.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point, because we've run into this issue internally where we use a list subset. We talk about the DISCO methodology specifically focused on the C, which is the calculation, and the O, which is the output. Oftentimes, if you have an output that doesn't have your subset, but the calculation does, and you're not maintaining it properly, you could come into instances where you're not actually capturing the full information on the output, which is usually shared with end users. Mm-hmm. What are some other areas where you found the ability to reduce sparsity?
I mean, a big one within a module itself is looking at the summary of that specific line item, right? Yep. So if this calculation for a specific line item maybe doesn't need all of the top members or parent members to do that calculation, turn that summary off, because if you are calculating everything at a low level and it's a 6-level hierarchy, yep, rolling all that up can increase cell size substantially. So getting rid of that summary decreases that cell size, and that only happens at that lowest level. A lot of that happens too with list formatted line items, right? A lot of those you don't need summary on, so that's going to save a lot of space going forward. Do you guys have any other techniques?
Yeah, so actually just coming off your summary, we preach that all the time. One of our best practices is by default turning off the summary on your line items. We find it always easier to turn back on the summaries than to go back into the model once it's completed and finding opportunities to be able to turn off the summaries. Some of the other things that we do, I call them concatenated lists. Let's say you have stores that have products. Instead of dimensionalizing a module by those two different lists, where you might not have products applying to all the different stores, you can create a concatenated list where you still have your storefronts, but you only apply the products that are necessary for the stores, and you're able to reduce the sparsity then when you're doing the calculations or creating the inputs assumptions within your module.
Okay, nice.
Yeah, and there's also some new features in the product too that have come out recently that we've certainly loved leveraging. One of them are the time ranges. So being able to create time ranges based on the actual time frame that you need within your module. We use those all the time as well to reduce sparsity. How about from you guys' end? Anything else?
Subsidiary views are also something that you can do. So a line item subsidiary view within a module. Yep. So if the line item that you're being referenced from maybe doesn't have time attached to it, then you don't need time in yours, even though the module itself totally has time. Because if you have less dimensions in your subsidiary view than the module itself, it's still going to show up in that module where applicable. Whereas I know that it is bad practice sometimes to have those subsidiary views in the modules. Yeah. So if you have more dimensions than the module itself, then I say no, have your own module, right? Yep. But if it does have less, then definitely look at that. But look at where that line item is being referenced in the future, as well as where it's coming from, to see exactly what dimensions are needed and need within that line item itself.
Yeah.
Boom.
So Anaplan 78, hopefully that gives you some insight and ability to reduce your model sparsity. Thank you very much.
Lean, mean machine.
Lean, mean machine.
Community member Fabian Janode asked for advice on when to use a composite list versus a flat list? Now I know, Pierre, you probably deal a lot with this type of question with the Anaplan and Anaplan team and your internal COE. So you have any insight for Fabian?
Yeah, so we apply two different rules based on whether it's the data hub you're looking at or your production models. And I'll start by talking about the data hub, and then I'm curious to know your thoughts on the production models. But anytime we're doing anything in our data hub, we want to reduce the sparsity as much as possible. And that means everything that sits in our data hub sits flat, even our lists. So what we'll do is we'll create list structures that are flat, and then to be able to define what the parent-child relationship might be in the production models, we'll actually create properties or line items within the modules to define what actually the relationship is between the lists in terms of which one is a child and which one is a parent. Now the benefit there is when we actually do the imports to construct the composite list in our production models, oftentimes we give the business the ability to define exactly what that hierarchy looks like. Meaning if you have 4 levels in your regional hierarchy as an example, and you only need the top level and the bottom level, by having it sit flat in your data hub, you can import the levels that you need very easily and remove the interim levels so that you can actually cut the sparsity in your production models as well.
Okay, nice. And yeah, for me on the pre-sales side, it's kind of all about that end user functionality, right? What is the end user trying to do? Are they trying to look at their entire employee roster and put in information at that level, at a sales ops level? So then maybe they want to see their entire employee roster flat. Or am I a manager only wanting to see my direct reps for, say, quota or something like that, right? Because in that type of term, you're going to want that composite list of being able to see your children of the parent. And then that can get into also selective access is a big thing, is a big consideration when thinking about either flat or composite, because it's a lot easier to set selective access on a composite list versus a hierarchy. And then in terms of what looks cool and that's demoable, I'm all about synchronized selection on a dashboard. So being able to click on a parent and all of the modules below sync to the children of that parent so they only see what they need to see is very beneficial and kind of, blows people's minds a little bit.
Yeah, I think in terms of the production models, you're absolutely right. You got to think about the end user and how they want to interact with the model. If it makes sense where they need the summary views, then of course use the composite list. If they don't, then perhaps it might be more suitable to use a flat list.
Yeah, and then one last key point is to always be able to map, that flat list to that composite list in some way, right? So map that flat list to the composite list, whether it be, the display name of the composite list is a list format from that flat list, because being able to input, say, your start date or end date on that flat list and have that same member then being able to reference that so that you can reference it in the composite list in the same way is very beneficial, and it makes that go a lot more quick and easy. So for instance, find item is a nice way to do this as well. So keeping that systematic where it's not a big manual process to map those two together, I think.
Agreed. Awesome. Well, thank you, John. That was really helpful.
Not as helpful as yours.
Community member Debbie5154 asked a question around best practices when it comes to list and list structures. John, I'm curious to know your take on some of the best practices that you've implemented when it comes to lists and list structures.
So one major thing that I've noticed helps with the eye a lot when you have a lot of lists, right, is with a composite list to have a fake header list on top of that composite list. So break out those composite lists with a nice little header list so that they can break out nicely. And then your last one is just going to be a header list that says maybe flat list and break that all out.
Yeah.
And then within the composite lists themselves, if it's a 5-level hierarchy, put the L1, L2, L3 at the beginning of the list instead of the end, because then I feel like it's easier when I'm formatting a line item that I need that specific list for. It's a lot easier to do the L1, L2, L3 and do it that way as opposed to putting it at the end of the list.
Yeah, actually you bring up an interesting point. Some of the things that we do internally in terms of best practices when it comes to our list naming conventions. All of our lists by default will start with a lowercase letter, and then what we do is with all of our modules, we uppercase them. And then when you're looking at a formula in a line item, you can quickly differentiate whether that belongs to a list or a line item. The other thing we do with our lists is we always create a prefix whenever we're bringing information in from another source or another model, and that prefix is the abbreviation of what that source actually is. So we abbreviate all of our models. So if we're actually creating a list import from another model, that will be the prefix that we have then in the target model. Or if it's a list that originates from one of our source systems, whether it's our ERP or CRM system, we'll have abbreviations for each one of those. And so as a user, you can easily differentiate what the source is and where the list actually originates from. So Debbie actually provided a screenshot of the list structure that she currently has in her model. And actually just taking a look at the screenshot here, you can see a number of things that Debbie's done well. Obviously, she's established top levels properly. And where she has children, obviously she avoids having a top level. And then she seems to have her composite lists structured properly. Going back to your naming conventions, you can see she has actually identified the level in which the list belongs to. Now, if we look at the item count, one of the things I noticed right away is you have site listed a number of times. So we have the L2 site, but you also have the container L2 site. And then you have a site for your fill rate and the site for the harvest profile. And the item counts there seem to be a little less than the original L2 site. Makes me think that perhaps she has a subset of her overall sites within those lists. Now, one of the things that you should keep in mind when you're constructing your list that oftentimes I think people forget is if you do have a list that's going to be referenced multiple times and you're only looking to create a parent relationship of the subset, you can actually create the relationship directly in your configure tab. So in this particular case, if we look back at the L2 site list, we can see we have the full list and then we have a number of subsets and we've identified what those subsets will be. Mm-hmm. And so for example, if our container site list just needs to be a subset of this entire list, we've denoted those. And then if we have to apply the L3 containers to that specific subset, we can do so in the configure tab. So when you're creating the parent relationship, it doesn't necessarily have to be to the entire list. You can actually create the parent to the subset itself.
Nice.
So so the feedback here is if these are actually subsets of the sites, then instead of creating duplicates of your region and sites, just have your L3s roll back up to the subset of the L2 sites.
It's a good little tip and trick. Can you go back to the other to kind of show the headers then? How we have the headers in there nicely. So we're breaking up that the different composite hierarchy lists appropriately so your eye is, better fixed and broken up where it needs to be. And she's got, the num, where she's got num. You can see she's got the hashtag here to signify a numbered list here or just the NBR here. So I've done that to show different ways that I've kind of shown the numbered list.
Yep.
Pierre, I'm curious, when would you use a numbered list versus a non-numbered list?
Yeah, so we have some rules in terms of when we use a numbered list versus a non-numbered list. The first one is anytime your list element name needs to be greater than 60 characters. Obviously, you can't do that with a native list, so we automatically shift to a numbered list. The other times where a numbered list is appropriate is when you have elements that share the same name. So oftentimes you'll find this with employee rosters, where you might have the same name across an organization. In that particular case, you would need to use a numbered list as well.
Nice. Yeah, and I like to kind of have fun with my numbered list too. So I will use, the ranking of the hashtag 1, hashtag 2, hashtag 3. So if I'm adding, say, a plan, if I have scenarios, I'm clicking a button to add a scenario, it's going to automatically create that display name for me based off of that rank of the numbered list. So I can automatically create the name without having someone type in plan 1, plan 2, plan 3, right? They can automatically click the action and then that name will automatically populate based off how many members there are of that list.
Yeah, and actually you bring up a good point. Anytime you're looking to use the action to create an element within the list, obviously that has to be a numbered list as well. Unfortunately, that functionality is not available with a native list.
Yeah, it's true.
So,
community member MyL is looking at assigning the same item member to multiple parents.
Yeah, and more specifically, John, what she's looking to do is assign the same product to multiple teams. So what we've done here is we've actually mocked up a couple quick lists that help illustrate what MyL is trying to achieve. So in this particular case, we have a native list that's set up with all the different products. We also have a list. Again, this is a native list for the teams. And what we ultimately want to do is assign the same products to multiple teams. So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to have to use a numbered list. And to be able to use a numbered list, you can assign a list as a numbered list in the configure tab. So we'll go ahead and assign it as a numbered list. I've already applied it here in this case. And then the other thing that you got to do with a numbered list is have a display name to associate with the name of the element itself. So usually what people will do is create a display name and format it as text. One of the things that most people don't realize is that the display name can actually be a list format as well. So in this case, because we're looking to assign the products to the teams, we'll probably want to use the product name as the name of the element in the list itself. So I've gone ahead and formatted this as a list with the product list itself. And then what we see is if we go back to the grid view here, we have a series of products that are assigned to each of the different teams. If we want to go ahead and add another product to one of these teams, let's say we want to add a new product to team 2, we'll go ahead and insert. And then here on my display name column, I can go ahead and associate which product it is that falls within this team. So perhaps it's product 9. Now the nice thing about setting up your display name formatted as a list is anytime you need to do a lookup or leverage of some function, instead of having to do a find item to convert your text display name to a list format, you already have it in one place, so you're not duplicating anything, and then you can always point back to your display name.
Yeah, this is a nice little example of mapping a flat list or your products list, right, to ultimately a composite hierarchy, this products to teams, where you can have the same product rolling up to multiple teams, right? And then using that sum or the formula to ultimately pull it back if needed.
Exactly.
Cool little trick, Pierre.
Yep. All right, John. Community member Edgar Gomez wants to view different levels of the same list within a dashboard. What do you got for us?
Yeah, this seems to be a common problem along model builders. So you can see from the screen here, what we have is the same module represented 3 different times on the same dashboard, and you can see that different levels of the module is showing, right? There's a composite hierarchy being used. This is the L2 level, then we have the L3 and the L4. Now this is great, but what functionality that you lose here when using the select levels to show, so for instance, you're using that reselect levels to show. Yep. I'm only going to show one item. You're losing that synchronized selection option. So I can't click on a top level and everything that's below it ultimately sync to that. Yep. So today I'm going to serve you a nice little workaround using the ratio summary on this. So in order to get this synchronized selection back up and optimize your end user functionality, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show all rows for this specific list. So you can see it kind of blows up to the entire thing on all 3, right?
Yep.
Now you can see when I do that, I have that nice sync select back on, okay? So what I'm ultimately going to do is instead of using select levels to show, I'm going to fake that using a filter, okay? So you can see I have this levels ultimately line item. That's ultimately what I'm going to be using as a filter. So let me go data filter. And after I do this, I will dig deeper into what exactly is being done on the deep end.
Okay.
So this one is going to be showing that level 4. So you can see we have east, right?
Yep.
This filter is ultimately going to be I only want to see things equal to level 3. And then this one is going to be filtered to just things that are equal to level 2. So you can see then I have the same type of look that I had before, as well as I still have the synchronized selection on, right? So what I can do is I'm going to add the synchronized selection to all of these, but not this top one, because ultimately this is what we're going to do. Okay. What I can do now, though, after this is all set up, is simply click on East, and now you can see everything else now syncs to things that only roll up to that level East. If I click on West, boom, there you go. You got the California Oregons rolling up, and then we can go farther down is clicking on farther down and farther down.
So this is really cool. I got to ask you, though, how did you construct that line item in which you have the dimension associated to each of the elements within your list?
Yeah, let me dig down and show you kind of how that gravy is made.
All right.
As you can see now, we have a 5-level hierarchy. So this module is being done at the lowest level. And what I've done ultimately is create a line item for each level of that hierarchy, right? So I have an L4, L3, L2, L1, and as you can see, the applies to also equals that specific level of the hierarchy. Yep. I then have a denominator line item that's always 1, and that one is ultimately set to formula because I want it to be 1 all the way across, because I'm basically I'm substituting every summary
Yep.
for the level above's number, using that level above divided by the denominator every time, divided
So
by
you're
1.
essentially aggregating up your summaries, starting with your lowest level, moving up the chain.
Exactly. So then you can see, for instance, for this L2, the total is L4, right? We're looking at that L4, but if you go into the ratio, we have that ratio summary set up, and that's ultimately going to be set up for the L1 numerator, which is going to be 5, right? Divided by the denominator, which is 1. So then we can substitute that ratio for the ultimate of this one looking forward. So if we go into here and we find something at the L5, there you go. We have our L5, and we've ultimately substituted this L5 summary or L4 summary to the L5, and you do that all the way up. You keep working that all the way up until you get each level of this basically is signified by a specific number. So then you can just simply use that in the filter to say, hey, I want this one equal to level 2, or you could see it even greater than level 2, or you could set up a filter module that says, hey, I want the end user to say, hey, I only want to see level 3 and level 5, and then have that formulaically set to this filter here on the right that then signifies to only show those specific things with, again, keeping that synchronized selection functionality intact.
So I got to tell you, this sounds really complicated. Is there some content on Community that we can go to better understand how these ratios work?
Yes, we do have some content on Community, an Excel blueprint that shows kind of how to set this up. And once you do it one time, you can then keep redoing it over and over. Once you get the concept down, it's really easy to kind of duplicate into your system. And this is kind of one way that I've used like ratios to kind of solve a problem or a workaround within Anaplan that seem like something that should be fairly easy, but it actually becomes a little complex once you get down into it. Do you have any examples of that?
Yeah, I do. So we actually use the ratios anytime, like you said, you're trying to consolidate up your summaries. And one of the areas that this works really nicely in is finance. So I have a very basic financial use case here. I got a simple line item that denotes the revenue over time. And oftentimes what you're doing in a financial use case is trying to determine what your period over period change is. Now, if you were just to use the basic formula, which is often going to be your current period minus your previous period divided by your previous period, the way that Anaplan usually aggregates those up are going to be things like minimum or maximum or your summation. But let's say you have a use case in which you wanted to see the quarter over quarter split on your quarterly summary, or you wanted to see your year over year growth on your year. Where you can use ratio is to consolidate up starting with your year, moving all the way to the month. So if we go into the blueprint view here and we take a look at how this was constructed, you can see I have 3 different line items that are helping me calculate the period over period change. I'm using the same formula for each of the line items. The only thing that changes between each of these line items is going to be my time scale. So at the very bottom, I have a line item denoted with my yearly time scale. Then moving up, I got the quarter, and then finally the month. Now I do the same thing with the ratio denominator. I denote that as a 1. And this helps you create the denominator when you're using your ratio functionality, because it's going to ask for both your numerator and denominator. And because I want my values to remain constant, again, I'm applying the 1 to that. So at the very lowest level, I still have it aggregating up as a sum. It makes no difference here because it's going to be the year, unless you have total periods. Then when I get into my quarterly line item, here's where I'm going to aggregate up my year. And if I can open this summary up, you would see that the numerator is set to the year over year change line item. And then if I was to do the same where I opened up my period over period change, which is calculating my monthly changes, you would see that the numerator is set to the quarter. So what exactly happens is, like you referenced, your year gets rolled up to your quarter, and your quarter line item gets rolled up to your monthly line item. And at the end, when you're looking at the highest level line item, you can see your period changes at a monthly level, at a quarterly level, and then at the yearly level.
Nice. So you're consolidating also your month over month, your quarter over quarter, and your year over year line items all into one line item essentially, right?
Correct, yeah.
Very cool. And so that's a nice little tip that you can use ratios to kind of solve some summary problems that you would run into in a model.
Correct. And that's it.
Be sure to visit the community page, take the survey, and let us know how we did.
And on behalf of Jon,
behalf of Pierre,
thanks for watching.
what he said.